Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion class. We are on week 5, and today we'll be reading over the Metamorphosis and looking at the paradoxical power of self-sacrifice. Before we jump in, we'll do a little bit of review. Last week we concluded the trial with a discussion of shame, which seemed to intertwine our refusal to listen to ourselves about who we are, and especially what haunts those who feel power. So, there's that notion of shame, an inability to take responsibility for oneself, a desire to control others even though you don't have self-responsibility, and all that gets intertwined into a sense of shame, which ends up being the verdict in some ways of the trial. This week, we continue to look at the feelings of guilt and shame as part of what Kafka locates as the essential component of what makes us human. The implication of this, of course, is that a refusal to engage with these qualities undermines our humanity at its very core, literalized in Gregor Samsa's transformation or metamorphosis. Today's class will explore the story by asking, what are the implications of submitting to the wishes of others, even when, unlike Joseph K., this submission is well-intended? Gregor seems like a very well-intentioned young man, right? He's noble, virtuous, whatnot, but things do not go well. I don't know of a Kafka story where things do go particularly well, but things really don't go particularly well for Gregor or his family. And so that's what we'll be looking at today. So, Kafka introduces the crux of the story in the first paragraph when the protagonist undergoes an unexpected transformation. Quote, "As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was laying on his hard, as it were, armor-plated back, and he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff, arched segments. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes." It's a rather strong start to a story. But the next paragraph reaffirms Samsa's humanness. The narrator describes a regular human bedroom. There's a, quote, table on which a collection of cloth samples was unpacked and spread out. Samsa was a traveling salesman. Above this table hangs the picture which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady with a fur hat on and a fur stole, sitting upright and holding out to the spectator a huge fur muff, into which the whole of her forearm had vanished. That's Samsa's art. There's not much more to be said for Gregor's personality than that, though, right? He cuts out a picture, and that's all we know about really who he is as a person. But remarkably, given the fact that he's now a cockroach, he's pretty calm about things. Instead of worrying about the fact that he's an insect, he simply tries to ignore the reality of the situation. His thoughts are, quote, "What about sleeping a little longer and forgetting all this nonsense?" he thought, but it could not be done, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side, and in his present condition he could not turn himself over. That's a problem. From there, Samsa's thoughts turn into something most people identify with, wishing that one did not have to go to work. Quote, "What an exhausting job I picked out for myself. On the road, day in, day out, there's the trouble of constant traveling, of worrying about train connections, the bad food and irregular meals, casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends. The devil take it all." Doesn't like his job, he doesn't want to go. But his internal dialogue, which is quite mundane, becomes juxtaposed with the physical reality of his insectoid status. And that's one of the joys of the story. You have these really odd descriptions of what it'd be like to be a human consciousness within a cockroach body, interspersed with the most banal, mundane, tedious descriptions of the life of a traveling salesman. And it does a really nice job of interplaying off each other. And so I had to hold back on giving a lot of the quotes of the physical description of cockroachness, but this one I wanted to pick up on in particular. He felt a slight itching up on his belly, slowly pushed himself on his back nearer the top of the bed so that he could lift his head more easily, identified the itching spot, which was surrounded by many small white spots, the nature of which he could not understand, and was about to touch it with a leg, but drew the leg back immediately, for the contact made a cold shiver run through him. I don't know. I've never been a cockroach. Maybe that's right. But unlike most of our jobs, Kafka adds that Gregor has an additional burden that keeps him tied to his employment despite his dislike for it. Quote, "If I didn't have to hold back because of my parents, I'd have given notice long ago. I'd have gone to the boss and told him exactly what I think of him. That would knock him right off his desk. Well, there's still hope. Once I've saved enough money to pay back my parents' debts to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it without fail. I'll cut my ties completely then. For the moment, though, I'd better get up since my train leaves at 5. The narrator shows the literalization of power in the office, where the boss literally sits on his desk and speaks down to his employees. It spatializes that power relationship. Kafka also shows that Gregor is essentially in a state of indentured servitude, working to pay back the debts incurred by his parents. But the world of work and his everyday existence successfully distracts Gregor from the reality of his having been transformed into an insect. Right? Once he starts thinking about his job and why he has it, he doesn't have to think about being a cockroach anymore, or whatever kind of insect it is. Gregor then agonizes about making the next train, about being written up, and realizes, quote, that the next train went at 7 o'clock. To catch that, he would need to hurry like mad, and his samples weren't even packed, and he himself wasn't feeling particularly fresh and energetic. Well, supposing he were to say he were sick. But that would be very awkward and would look suspicious, since during his 5 years' employment he had not been ill once. The boss himself would be sure to come with the health insurance doctor, would reproach his parents for their son's laziness, and would cut all excuses short by handing the matter over to the insurance doctor, who of course regarded all mankind as perfectly healthy malingerers. And would he be so far wrong in this case? Gregor really felt quite well, apart from a drowsiness that was quite inexcusable after such a long sleep, and he was even unusually hungry. The success of Gregor's strategy of avoidance, his will to embrace the ordinary, emerges as he's able to overlook his inability to communicate. His family begins to pester him as they realize he's still at home, and he has a shock, quote, as he heard his own voice answering hers, his mother's, unmistakably his own voice, it was true, but with a persistent, horrible, twittering squeak behind it, like an undertone, which left the words in their clear shape only for the first moment, and then rose up reverberating around them to destroy their sense, so that one could not be sure one had heard them rightly. Gregor dismisses the voice as, quote, the precursor of a bad cold, a typical ailment of traveling salesmen, and he, quote, looked forward eagerly to seeing this morning's delusions gradually evaporate. Now, all of this is important because through it, Kafka shows our fixation on what is ordinary and predictable in the world, in spite of impossible odds. In this case, Gregor overlooks all evidence of his senses in order to remain part of the world of familiarity. Readers who are shocked at Samsa's inability to grasp his condition authentically are in this way invited to think about their own lives and about what they're willing to overlook to continue clinging to a world that's familiar, even if it's despised. I mean, that sounds pretty familiar, right? Like the ability to overlook all manner of catastrophe in order to pretend that everything will be fine tomorrow, right? It's a very human quality, and Gregor Samsa, in spite of his form, remains very, very human throughout. Does that make sense? Okay. So Kafka then goes on to detail the struggle that a man-sized insect would have when presented with human objects like a quilt, which involves Gregor's physical difficulty getting out of bed. He still desires to simply lay quiet, quote, breathing lightly, as if perhaps expecting the total silence around him to restore all things to their real and normal condition. He's not worried about being a bug. In fact, his biggest worry, this is a quote, peculiarly enough, was the loud crash he would not be able to help making, which would probably cause anxiety, if not terror, behind all the doors. You know, his worry is only to disturb others around him. He's not at all concerned about his own condition. And he genuinely seems unconcerned, right? His thoughts never rest on what it means to be who he is or what he is at this point. It's only looking out for others. His consciousness is always externalized primarily to the family around him. And that's it. That's what his sense of self is. So, he's finally prompted out of bed by the arrival of the chief clerk at his house, who's sent to check on things. Gregor then bemoans his lot in life. Quote, what a fate, to be condemned to work for a firm where the slightest negligence at once gave rise to the gravest suspicion. Here again, employment worries are more important than his bizarre physical predicament. His mother protests that Gregor has no life outside of work, which one believes is true, but it's of no use. The chief clerk chastises Gregor, saying, quote, here you are, barricading yourself in your room, giving only yes and no for answers, causing your parents a lot of unnecessary trouble, and neglecting your business duties in an incredible fashion. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and of your employer, and I beg you quite seriously to give me an immediate and precise explanation. I thought you were a quiet and dependable person, and now all at once you seem bent on making a disgraceful exhibition of yourself. Your position in the firm is not exactly unassailable. For some time now, your work has been most unsatisfactory. A time of year for doing no business at all? That does not exist, Mr. Samsa. Must not exist. The chief clerk in this way summons all manner of authority figures to shame and guilt Gregor for the crime of negligence, and makes clear that in this world, one moment of potential physical weakness is enough to undermine years of work. There's no job stability. There's no promise of anything permanent. It's always threatened to go up in smoke. So, as a response, Gregor decides to open the door at long last, motivated by a need to clear himself of the guilt imposed upon him. Quote, he actually meant to open the door, actually meant to show himself and speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to find out what the others, after all their insistence, would say at the sight of him. If they were horrified, then the responsibility was no longer his, and he could relax. It's a nice little if-then logical statement, right? But if they took it in stride, he had no reason either to be upset, and could actually get to the station for the 8 o'clock train if he hurried. But the sound of his voice disturbs those on the other side of the door. The chief clerk says that was the voice of an animal. As his family bustles to find a doctor and a locksmith, Gregor has the opposite reaction. Quote, Gregor was now much calmer. The words he uttered could no longer be understood apparently, although they seemed clear enough to him. Yet at any rate, people now believed that something was wrong with him and were ready to help. The positive certainty with which these first measures had been taken comforted him. He felt himself drawn once more into the human circle and hoped for great and remarkable results both from the doctor and the locksmith, without really distinguishing precisely between them. To make his voice as clear as possible for the crucial consultations that were soon to take place, he cleared his throat a little, as quietly as he could, of course, since this noise too might not sound human for all he was able to judge. End quote. Kafka emphasizes Gregor's need to be part of the human circle, in spite of the cruelty that this circle embodies. He wishes to speak and to be understood, and wishes for experts to attend to his plight. Communication is, of course, a prerequisite for entrance into this world, the human world, right? If you can't communicate, you're not part of it. Encouraged, Gregor unlocks the door, which Kafka details in a delightful fashion, and presents himself to the outside world. Here's the result. Quote, he heard the chief clerk utter a loud, "Oh." He could see the man, standing as he was nearest to the door, clapping one hand over his open mouth and slowly backing away as if he were being repelled by some unseen but inexorable force. His mother first clasped her hands and looked at his father, then took 2 steps toward Gregor and fell on the floor, her face completely hidden on her breast. His father clenched one fist with a fierce expression on his face as if he meant to knock Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept until his great chest heaved. Doesn't go over very well. Given the chaos, though, Gregor suddenly feels somewhat empowered. Well, said Gregor, knowing perfectly well that he was the only one who had retained any composure, I'll get dressed right away, pack up my samples, and start off. Will you be willing to let me go? You see, sir, I'm not stubborn and I like my work. Traveling is a hard life and I couldn't live without it. And so he continues, listing how he hopes the chief clerk will stand up for him, how hard he will work, etc., etc. But his speech has the opposite of its intended effect. Quote, at Gregor's very first words, the chief clerk had already backed away and only stared at him with parted lips over one twitching shoulder, and Gregor realized that the chief clerk must on no account be allowed to go away in this frame of mind if his position in the firm were not to be endangered to the utmost. His parents had convinced themselves in the course of years that Gregor was settled for life in this firm, and besides, they were so preoccupied with their immediate troubles that all foresight had forsaken them. But Gregor had this foresight. The chief clerk must be detained, soothed, persuaded, and finally won over. The whole future of Gregor and his family depended on it. And once again, and throughout the whole of the story, Gregor's thoughts are selfless. They look out to the others who depend upon him. His family's dependence, however, seems odd, given that his father can remain stretched out for over breakfast for hours over various newspapers. You know, his family does not live a hard life. Gregor does. But the sight of Gregor sets everyone in chaos and panic. The chief clerk flees, screaming, which sets his father to driving Gregor back into his room, which slams shut after him, and that ends chapter 1. Any questions about chapter 1? Okay. Chapter 2. During Chapter 2, Kafka goes into more detail about Gregor's relationship to the rest of the family, especially on his responsibility to work. Gregor had been of the opinion that nothing at all was left over from his father's business, and, quote, his sole desire was to do his utmost to help the family forget as soon as possible the catastrophe that had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into a state of complete despair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardor, and almost overnight had become a traveling salesman instead of a little clerk, with, of course, much greater chances of earning money, and his success was immediately transformed into hard cash which he could lay on the table for his amazed and happy family. Later on, Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expenses of the whole household, and did so. They had simply gotten used to it, both the family and Gregor. The money was gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there was no special outpouring of warm feeling. That's the family situation. What Kafka deftly paints is a bifurcated picture of inhumanity that's divided between poles of selflessness and selfishness. Gregor seemingly thinks only about the family, and the family thinks only of themselves. Once Gregor earns, no one else needs to work. And this explains in part his incredible desire to go to work despite being an insect. Right? And so when you're looking at humanity, the selfishness of the family seems inhuman, right? That they would do that to Gregor, who's just trying to be a nice guy. Right? But the family isn't transformed into insects. Gregor is. Right? And so part of Kafka's point seems to be looking at the inhumanity of Gregor and the inhumanity of that kind of selflessness, which isn't, in some ways, particularly noble. It appears to be noble, and Gregor might want it to be noble, but there's something inhuman about that kind of nobility. It's inhuman to care so little about one's own self. And that might sound odd, but remember what we've just heard about Joseph K. And Joseph K's inability to care about the nature of his self, right? The person that he is, or the kind of person that he is. Gregor does the same thing as Joseph. I mean, he's not trying to seize the world with 20 hands for his own sake, but he's trying to seize the world with 20 hands for his family's sake. And in so doing, he never pauses to think about who he is, what he wants, or what his vocation in life could be. Does that make sense? It's inhuman to not think about oneself. And that seems to be part of what Kafka's sketching out. All right. So at the same time, during the crisis, the family finds ways to get along. The crisis incurred by Gregor's illness, or whatever you want to call it. First, quote, a certain amount of money, not all that much really, had survived the wreck of their fortunes and had even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile. So they have that money that was still stashed away. And then, quote, the money Gregor brought home every month, he had kept only a few thalers for himself, had never been quite used up, and now amounted to a substantial sum. So they've been saving what Gregor's been giving them, even though he hasn't kept any for himself. Gregor's response is delight at, quote, this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could have really paid off some more of his father's debts to the head of the firm with this extra money, and thus brought much nearer the day on which he could quit his job, but doubtless it was better the way his father had arranged it. End quote. It's at this point that the reader can understand why it was so important to underscore Gregor's refusal to look at reality and to attempt to work. It allows us here to accept his inability to realize the truth about his father and his family. Right? The same blindness that allows him to overlook the fact that he's now an insect is a blindness that's long-standing within Gregor's life. And that's why we need to learn the most extreme case first, so that more subtle sense can become more clear in the structure of the story. At best, however, Gregor surmises that they can only last 2 years, and that's by draining the capital. Money for living expenses would have to be earned. So this is the situation Gregor finds his family in. Sadly, quote, his father was still healthy enough but an old man and had done no work for the past 5 years and could not be expected to exert himself. During these 5 years, the first years of leisure in his laborious though unsuccessful life, he put on a lot of weight and become sluggish. So his dad can't work. Gregor's mother couldn't earn a living, quote, with her asthma, which troubled her even when she walked through the apartment and kept her lying on a sofa every other day, panting for breath beside an open window. Quote. And his sister, quote, was still a child of 17, and whose life hitherto had been so pleasant, consisting as it did in dressing herself nicely, sleeping long, helping with the housework, going out to a few modest entertainments, and above all, playing the violin. At first, whenever the need for earning money was mentioned, Gregor let go of the door and threw himself down on the cool leather sofa beside it. He felt so hot with shame and grief. His family can't be expected to work. But you see his perspective on it, right? Even his sister needs to have hours to dress, long hours to sleep. I mean, she's 17. All 17-year-old girls sleep and dress up and go out for modest entertainments. And she needs to play the violin on top of it, right? He needs to be there for his family. And that's all that he's able to see. So in the meantime, Gregor continues to become more insectoid. So, I mean, as he's thinking of his family and the history of what's been going on, Kafka also describes his new habits. Quote, "For mere recreation, he had formed the habit of crawling crisscross over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging suspended from the ceiling. It was altogether different from lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely. One's body swung and rocked lightly, and in the almost blissful absorption induced by this suspension, it could happen, to his own surprise, that he let go and fell plop on the floor." He tries to remember the importance of things like furniture and preserves the picture in a frame, but becomes increasingly comfortable in his insectoid world. His family, on the other hand, begins to adjust. The transformation is most clear with his father, who, quote, "used to lie wearily sunk in bed whenever Gregor set out on a business trip, who on the evenings of his return welcomed him back lying in an easy chair in his bathrobe, who could not really rise to his feet, but only lifted his arms in greeting. But now he was standing there straight as a stick, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, such as bank attendants wear." The chapter ends in a battle between the family and Gregor, attempting to put him back into the room, which concludes with his father throwing apples at his son, lodging one into his back. So, at the beginning of the chapter, I mean, there's the whole history of how unsuited for work the family is, but it ends with this like beaming, heroic portrait of his father dressed as a bank attendant. So that's chapter 2. Questions so far? All right. On we go to chapter 3. In the third chapter, Kafka uses the presence of boarders, who are treated with absolute respect, to allow Gregor to realize the absolute futility of his existence. Having attempted to earn affection through becoming a purely functional being, and having failed to do so, Gregor realizes that all that is left for him to do is die. And it's that kind of functionality that's part of what, in addition to selflessness, Gregor's nothing but function, right? His function is to earn money, and that's it. He loses his humanity at the point at which he fails to become a person and becomes only useful. And there's a pleasure in being useful. There's a pleasure in being valued in being useful. But in Gregor's case, that exhausts who he is utterly. He has no time left for himself after his use. All that he is useful. And once his function is exhausted, there's nothing left of him to be remembered relative to his family. He becomes a machine, right? Or functionally. All he has is use value. There's no inherent worth left. So, the process toward Gregor's biological death begins as he intuits the despair of his family members. And that creates a helplessness and a hopelessness which, like the apple, slowly infects him. Quote, "What really kept them from moving into another apartment was rather their own complete hopelessness and the belief that they had been singled out for a misfortune such as never had happened to any of their relations or acquaintances." Note, the family here is bemoaning their misfortunes, not Gregor's. "They fulfilled to the utmost all the world demands of poor people. The father fetched breakfast for the minor clerks in the bank. The mother devoted her energy to making underwear for strangers. The sister trotted back and forth behind the counter at the demand of her customers. But more than this, they had not the strength to do." What sustains Gregor during this time is that, quote, "the next time the door opened, he would take the family's affairs in hand, again just as he once used to do. He reflects on the people he once knew, but instead of helping him and his family, they were all inaccessible, and he was glad when they vanished. right? So Gregor is just waiting to wake up. I mean, just as he did one day as a bug, he's waiting to wake up as a human and come out and become the hero for his family once again and set everything into order and let everything be as it should be. It still isn't happening. So the family takes on boarders, who are 3 serious gentlemen with full beards. The beards are very prominent throughout the story relative to the boarders, and whose presence meant that all of the furnishings and everything that would suggest mess or clutter was pushed into Gregor's room. So Gregor's room has already kind of become the junk room, and with the boarders, more and more junk is pushed in, restricting Gregor's space further and further and further. One night, Gregor's sister plays the violin, which is something the boarders intimated desiring, although they were displeased with the actual performance. Gregor's sister isn't that good, apparently. For Gregor, however, the introduction to music is revelatory. Quote, "Was he an animal, since music so moved him? He felt as if the way were opening before him to the unknown nourishment he craved." Which is an interesting thing. And again, this path through Kafka is one that focuses more on power. To understand humanity relative to animals is a whole nother way of approaching all of Kafka's canon. Equally valuable, equally interesting, not something that I'm going to take time for here, but moments like that I think are particularly, or at least potentially revelatory, if that makes sense. The boarders spot Gregor, chaos ensues, and they give notice that they'll leave without payment. Despairing, Greet, his sister, says, "We must try to get rid of it." His sister now said explicitly to her father, since her mother is coughing too much to hear a word. "It will be the death of both of you. I can see that coming. When one has to work as hard as we do, all of us, one can't stand this continual torment at home on top of it. At least I can't stand it any longer. You must just try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we've believed it for so long is the root of all of our misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If this was Gregor, he would have realized long ago that human beings can't live with such a creature, and he'd have gone away of his own accord. We wouldn't have any brother then, but we'd be able to go on living and keep his memory in honor. As it is, this creature persecutes us, drives away our boarders, obviously wants the whole apartment to himself, and would have us all sleep in the gutter." End quote. Greet interprets Gregor as a wholly selfless being, and thus finds that the creature's apparent selfishness means that Gregor himself is gone. All of Gregor's humanity has been swallowed up in the insect, but what Greet doesn't realize, and what I hope the reader does, is that his humanity was swallowed up long, long ago. Right? He doesn't have much humanity left, even before the transformation becomes physical. And that's what Greet doesn't recognize, and it's a really kind of minor strain that just starts to swell as the story continues to unfold. Greet's words strike home. Gregor, quote, "thought of his family with tenderness and love," which you would think is impossible at this point, but no, that's all he has left, right, is this idealized notion of family, because that's what he's devoted his life to, and nobody wants to be wrong about one's life's devotion and work, right? If you're going to have something that you give your life to, you better darn well make sure that you stay with it. Because to make a mistake at that point would render everything you've done meaningless, and that's something that every human wishes to avoid, right? Don't want to make a mistake at that level. So, the conviction that he must disappear is one that he held even more strongly than his sister, if that were possible. In this state of empty and peaceful meditation, he remained until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. The first broadening of light in the world outside his window just entered his consciousness. Then his head sank to the floor of its own accord, and from his nostrils came the last faint flicker of his breath. He's gone. His death, of course, is welcomed by the family. "Well," said Mr. Salsa, "now thanks be to God." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. And the demise requires a holiday, so the family, quote, "decided to spend the day in resting and in going for a stroll. They had not only deserved such a respite from work, but absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 notes of excuse. Mr. Samsa to his board of management, Mrs. Samsa to her employer, and Greet to the head of her firm. Then all 3 left the apartment and took the streetcar to the open country outside of town. The car, in which they were the only passengers, was filled with warm sunshine. Leaning comfortably back in their seats, they talked over their prospects for the future and it appeared on closer inspection that these were not all bad, for the jobs that they had, which so far they'd never really discussed with each other, were all three quite promising, and likely to lead to better things later on. The greatest immediate improvement in their situation would of course come from moving to another apartment. They wanted to take a smaller and cheaper, but also better situated and more practical apartment than the one they had, which Gregor had selected. While they were thus conversing, it struck both Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same moment as they became aware of their daughter's increasing vivacity, that in spite of all the sorrow of recent times, which had made her cheeks pale, she had bloomed into a pretty girl with a good figure. They grew quieter, and half unconsciously exchanged glances of complete agreement, having both come to the conclusion that it would be time to find a good husband for her. And it was like a confirmation of their new dreams and excellent intentions that at the end of their ride, their daughter sprang to her feet first and stretched her young body. Gregor's death frees the family to start becoming once again. It's a really sweet, happy, bliss. It's the happiest ending of any Kafka story. Now, I mean, the extent to which that's an actual happy ending for the family, or if that family deserves happiness, those are other questions. But there's a ray of hope in that beam of sunshine, spotlighting Greet's young, promising, blooming body. And so the story ends. Any questions about that? Yeah.
That's a very good explanation of it you gave. I can remember reading it years ago when I was young. All I got was the horror of it, see, the strangeness. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't able to make an analysis of it at all in the way you did. So now it makes a lot better sense than it did when all you felt was the horror and the strangeness.
And I totally agree with you. I had the same experience. The first time around, I just didn't get it. But this time, it makes sense, the way you're explaining it.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, what Kafka does, I mean, there's a lot of horror suggested in his stories. I mean, in the trial, or in the castle, or, I mean, in the parables, right? There's a nightmarish logic which plagues everything around the protagonists. But within that horror, there's a really nice relationship with the banal, and the mundane, and the ordinary. And Kafka makes it so that on the one hand, like in the trial, one's everyday mundane life becomes absolutely horrifying. And the flip side of that is to do something like the Metamorphosis, where this nightmarish world is rendered utterly mundane and ordinary, right? I mean, Gregor never ceases to be just a really banal functionary.
He might as well have, like, gotten injured at work or something.
Yeah. It doesn't matter that his cockroachness only matters to the others around him. He himself is absolutely indifferent to the fact that he's now an insect. You know, but the root of all of that is that he's not human. Or what makes a human human is something that he gave up long, long ago and sacrificed in the name of his family. So yeah, I mean, it's a disturbing story, but maybe the best way to put this is what makes the story most disturbing is how undisturbed Gregor Samsa is by it. Both the becoming a cockroach and the way that his family treats him are both unimportant to him, utterly. And what makes that horrifying, if it does, is how often we do that in our own lives. What we accept from others, what we live for, why we live for that. What we give up, what we sacrifice for absolutely nothing. And that's what's scary.
It's as if it's an extended metaphor for modern living.
Yeah. Yeah. And that modern living hasn't changed radically
that much
since Kafka wrote.
So what recourse do we have?
You know, this is the Masters of Suspicion class. So we're just learning how to become more critical surveyors of the world using philosophy and literature to highlight different kind of patterns of power and perspective. Kafka doesn't do much to give alternatives. I mean, in the trial, it'd be somebody more like Fräulein Bürstner, right? Somebody who's able to stand apart. The short story, The Metamorphosis, doesn't have enough competing figures. I mean, you don't have a sense that any of the characters in this story are really much better off than Gregor. Really. You know, they might be better off in some ways, but only seemingly. You know, at best, they're going to go on to have lives like Joseph K. At worst, I don't know. I mean, they're different kinds of bad. There's not really even a better between those. You know, so those alternatives don't really come. And I think part of what makes Kafka terrifying, again, in a way, is the notion that there are no good alternatives. If you're thrown into the modern world, if you have the fortune or misfortune of being born here, it's really hard to escape from the snares of power and hierarchy, and to get out of that system in a way that lets you be independent and autonomous in a respectable and worthwhile manner. It's really hard to do. And unless you can do that, there's very little hope. But the ability to do that is so rare, and there are so few examples of that one gives up. Despair lurks around every corner. Yeah.
The modern parallel may be the idea and the actuality of folks who live off the grid.
But there they lack human community. I mean, see, on the one hand, you get that independence, but on the other hand, the problem is that you don't have that kind of human community. I mean, that's the price that you pay for that, right? So on the one hand, you gain something, right, because you're outside of those networks of power, but being outside of those networks of power deprives you of that which you most want to enjoy in being human.
Unless there is a community of people.
That's
off
true.
The grid.
That's true.
But your point, both points are well taken.
And then you
I
can...
lived in Alaska. I knew people that lived off the grid, and actually a lot of people who were Vietnam vets who went up to Alaska to hide. My landlord was one of those, and he was an interesting character, but there was a tremendous sense of wanting to be on your own and really do your own thing. Yeah, very strong.
All right.
One thing I noticed, though, was really interesting, right at the end, when he said, you know, they wanted to get another apartment because he chose the apartment. And you see that conflict. He took over because he was selfless, but then he imposed what he wanted, and then they became passive in the face of it. And then when he left, oh, well, I guess we can manage.
Yeah, and so that actually segues right into the final three implications I had.
Perfect.
So, number one, Gregor, is just kind of summing up thoughts on the story. Gregor finds himself in a position where he takes responsibility for the family, and his family lets him take responsibility from them. This initially makes it seem like Gregor's acting selflessly and the family selfishly. Gregor's desire to manage the house's affairs, however, soon seems to be rather misguided. His sacrificial nature ends up being an odd source of power. He's willing to give up more than anyone else, to the point of accepting that he should die once he realizes what a burden he's been. The dynamics of power in this story show how Gregor's need for helpfulness is shaped. The family has no trouble pushing its demands on him to do more, to work harder, and to give up his life. Each of them, no doubt, believes themselves incapable, but their incapability is something that they co-create alongside Gregor. Right? It's not that Gregor forces them to be incapable, nor that they force Gregor to be selfless, right? It's both this version of reality that all four of them co-create together. It's nobody's fault, but it creates an unpleasant world for all involved. Kafka slowly shows how the very desire to be useful and helpful, even when intended lovingly, can help to destroy those whose virtues one sacrifices in order to protect. Gregor's father, mother, and sister develop a learned helplessness, which they seem happy to shed, although they never would have suspected this, right? It's the worst thing that could happen, they think, but it ends up, in some ways, making them healthier than they've been in years. 2. Kafka also shows the absurdity to which we'll take our will to cling to what's familiar. In Gregor's case, his will to believe that his family loves and appreciate him is as misguided as his thought that he could go to work as a bug. His need for approval from his job and from his family requires an ongoing recreation of reality that believes he is always in the wrong. This belief, again, does nothing but harm those he believes his love will help. Right? And so even when he gets a house or secures an apartment or tries to do this or tries to do that, his belief that he's always in the wrong is able to be suspended in order to actually do things, but it crushes him the moment that anything is done. Right? He has to do things, so he does them, but anything that he does, he also automatically feels guilty for doing, because all the choices he makes, even though he's the only one who can make them, are still the wrong choice. And again, it's the dynamic of power that's co-created within that family situation that makes it so that nothing good can come out. Nothing right will emerge. It's always going to founder on that just internal family dynamic, that system of power and balance that's been created. Number 3. Overall, the metamorphosis illustrates what becomes a stable balance of power. Those who are dependent control those who provide. Providers, especially those motivated by seemingly selfless motivations, never realize or are unwilling to use the power which they have to control their own lives. It's a stable system where those who actually have power remain loath to use it, and those who have little power are allowed to dominate. And this isn't just Kafka, right? I mean, you see this time and time again, where those who have wherewithal refuse to use it for their own good. The most Ayn Rand's novels do a great job of characterizing this. I won't speak much for her philosophy. I'm not an objectivist by any stretch of the imagination. But what her novels get right, and they do get some things right, is that, right? It's the same thing that I think is at the heart of what Kafka diagnoses in the Metamorphosis. The conclusions that Rand takes, again, I strongly disagree with. You know, it's not, I mean, just because there's a problem with some versions of selflessness does not give rise to the virtue of selfishness either, right? I mean, but, I mean, nonetheless, when you read The Fountainhead, or when you look at Atlas Shrugged, I mean, both of those novels sketch out something fairly similar to that, right? And it's that same kind of system of power where those who lack depend on those who have, and those who have are forbidden from express, or not forbidden, but understand to be ungracious to actually be who they are in any realistic way. And it creates a system of power that's, again, it's stable, it's functional, and it makes sure nothing ever happens. Nobody ever goes anywhere. Okay? And, I mean, you know, governmentally, what that ends up meaning, I'm sorry, I'm speaking off the cuff at this moment, so if I misspeak grotesquely, I ask that you'll accept my apology in advance. But what it means is that oftentimes government officials are those who lack all leadership abilities, which allows for business officials to go on unchecked, right? And so the business officials who actually have the ability to make decisions and do things, do so, right? And they're balanced out by a government that doesn't do anything. And in order to keep a stable system of power, you know, technological innovation, literary achievements, all of those things are kept outside of governmental power, which does its job by not leading. In a way that's very similar to Gregor Samsa's lack of leadership in being the only one to make decisions that count, but being blamed for all the things that actually happen. In the meantime, the talent is displaced. And that's, again, a very off-the-cuff analysis of American culture.
That works for me.
So take it for what it's worth. Any other questions?
Does that count? Is that a system of ethics? The way the power dynamics work, where the powerful actually become powerless, and vice versa?
I don't think it's quite a system of ethics. I think it just, I mean, because I don't think any ethical system would really praise Gregor, really, for sacrificing that core of humanity to the extent that he does. You know, there's a difference between being selfless in the way that, like, the Golden Rule would advise or something like that, and being selfless in a way that rids oneself of all humanity altogether. So I don't think it's an ethical system that does that. I think that, and here's again where Ayn Rand would come in and critique it. I think those ethical codes of selfishness are unfairly exploited against some people in order to create a world that benefits those who don't want to do as much, or to keep that kind of system intact. And again, I haven't thought through this at all, so I'm speaking incredibly loosely, but that's how I'd respond to that question.
All right.
Any other questions?
In any of Kafka's work, did he ever address drugs, psychedelic. I mean, when I read this, I thought I'd be shooting up every day.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, from most indications that I remember reading, he was a fairly abstemious fellow. Like, I don't think he was much given to overindulgence of any sorts of substances, psychedelic or otherwise, because he had enough problems going on. I mean, if you can write the Metamorphosis, you really don't need to be messing around with psychedelics, because you're
already on a higher plane.
yeah, or an altered enough plane that you don't want to disturb it any more than necessary.
Right, and that's part of what's going on in all of his things. It's some alternate reality, but it is the reality.
And it's a very telling illustration of what grounds the reality that we assume and take for granted. And again, really horrifying, disturbing, and incredibly ordinary ways. And that, again, I think is part of Kafka's genius. Yeah?
When I was reading this biography of him, the guy mentioned that he had had several fiancées, and that he had broken it off with them, not because he saw them as bad or inadequate, but because he saw himself as inadequate. See, he wasn't good enough for his would-be fiancées. So it was sort of strange to read that, because you thought, have you ever known anybody who broke off with their lover because they felt they weren't good enough?
The one most notable example is Soren Kierkegaard, whom Kafka had the either pleasure or misfortune of being introduced to at different points in his life. But Kierkegaard did basically the same thing with his fiancée, and just basically had to break off with Regine a couple of different times, feeling like he wouldn't be a good spouse. So, I mean, the one exemplar, the one who writes closest to despair. I mean, even some of the sections in The Great Wall and some of the sections in Sickness Unto Death pair up pretty well. Kierkegaard's an interesting figure to look at relative to Kafka, but again, that's another story for another time.
Also, J.D. Salinger's Seymour, he commits suicide because he doesn't feel, up to his fiancée also, and then also his family and stuff like that.
Perfect day for banana fish.
Banana fish, yeah.
I have a question. At that time, was it an arranged engagement?
I don't think so. I mean, he had a series of women that I think he found in life. I don't know for sure, but I didn't, from what I've read, get the impression that they were arranged for him.
Because it's a train or it's a bus where parents are with a young daughter. They talk about it.
Oh, that's true, about finding a suitable husband for her. Yeah, that's true. I don't think in Kafka's life that's something that had happened.
Okay.
So
There's actually a book I read, pretty voyeuristic. It's called Letters to Felice, who was one of his lovers. Not really lover, not in a literal physical sense. They only met in person a few times, but they exchanged extensive correspondence. And I don't know how you could love that guy, because his letters are so full of just horror and I couldn't think of anything while I was waiting for your letter to come, and then one of her letters will get lost in the mail, and he'll send 5 letters about how he's just I'm pretty sure I'm gonna die. I cannot handle this, and it's oh, take it easy, man. Take it easy.
a little intense.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he was a good storyteller.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of people can have bizarre thoughts, but to write it and make such good literature is something else. Yeah, amazing.
All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.